Welcome to this episode of From the Principal's Desk, a podcast about Lutheran schools and their leadership. This podcast is hosted by two Lutheran school leaders. My name is Rob Lunak, and I'm the superintendent of Lutheran Neighborhood Schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
My name is Mike Sheeman, and I'm principal at Bethany Lutheran School in Parma, Ohio. And we are actually excited because this week we have a 5-day week here at school, but next week the kids are all pumped because it is Parent-Teacher Conference Week. And we actually only have 2 days of school before we're giving the teachers Wednesday off, and they get a chance to prepare for their parent-teacher conferences. And then Thursday and Friday, it is game on. It is our full days where we get a chance to talk to all the parents and celebrate the student learning, but also share, some struggles that might be happening on the way, because as we've talked about before, communication with parents is absolutely key. It's absolutely vital. But one of the things that I've had discussions with various staff groups about is around the focus of parent-teacher conferences. Typically, the focus is on the student. So the question always came up with, should the student be there? Should the student be a part of the conference? And even going so far as, what level of leadership should the students have in these conferences, because it is about them and it is for them. And so in one school where I served, that led into the discussion about student-led conferences. I know this is something that's been discussed in education forums all over the place. Should you do them? What do they look like? What's the value? And Rob and I are hoping today to give a few ideas on student-led conferences and maybe allow you to think about, is this a best practice that you would like to implement? Are you happy with what you currently do? But how do you involve the students in their own review of their learning?
Now, we've had an episode before about regular, kind of traditional parent-teacher conferences. So if you're interested in finding that was maybe even last year, or kind of around the same time, I think, right near the end of first quarter. But talking about student-led conferences, that one, I don't know if everyone has a lot of experience with it. I know I hear about it a lot, but I definitely don't hear a lot about schools doing it all that often. And I think it's because of those things you mentioned. How often should the kid be involved? To what level? I think there's a little bit of trepidation, right? Because as a teacher, you go into parent-teacher conferences and you are really talking about the kid and less about you. But when it's student-led, you don't have any control over some of that narrative anymore. And how they represent really comes down to your prepping them and you're teaching them to do that, because without them being taught how to do it, they're not going to know how to do it. And it is definitely, I think I can say, a more involved and maybe a little more time-consuming method of conferences. It's not here's your kid's report card. As you can see, they're doing well in these classes and not doing well in these classes. End of conference. It's very much more the kid taking the ownership for their learning, and that's really the key. So from that lens, I don't know if there's a better method to get a kid to own their results than a student-led conference.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think if students can be involved in this, it gives them some ownership as well, and maybe even some pride in their learning. So one school where I served, what we did is we actually began the year, our first conference, it was a student-led conference, but we specifically called it a goal-setting conference. And we had the teachers would work with the kids to say, what are your learning goals for the year? How do you intend to achieve those? What are some benchmarks along the way? Like, we had a lot of one-on-one time with the kids to prep them for this. And in our middle school, the kids actually prepared Google slide presentations. And so then when it came time for their conference time, the teacher threw their presentation up on the smartboard and they walked the parents through all of this. Mom, dad, here's what I want to learn this year. Here's what my goals are. Here's how I'm going to achieve that. And the parents were really impressed. But it was kind of cool because even in that activity alone, it taught skills that are outside your typical curriculum standards. It's teaching the kids how to create a Google slide presentation, how to present to an audience. And we went through all that. We actually had the kids dress up because this was a very kind of professional thing that they came in, and then they had to present this to their parents. At the end, the parents were given forms too on how can you support your child's learning at home? What expectations do you have from the teacher regarding communication and so forth? But it was really kind of a neat way to have the student engage and to direct that conference so that they were involved in their learning. I don't know if you've seen anything similar to that, Rob, or if you've done that before, but what's your experience with that kind of stuff?
My experience with it is I've had some teachers that were kind of piloting it at a school I've been at, but never the whole staff doing it. And in those pilots, it was successful, but you also had a teacher who wanted it to be successful and was excited about doing that format differently. The parents, I think that at the end of the day, parents want to know, is their kid doing well? Is their kid liked? Is their kid happy? Those are their big things. If a kid's getting all A's, parents go to the conference, he's happy, he's got all A's, great, conference over. It's when not even academics, because the grades should never be a surprise to a parent coming into conferences. Never, ever, ever. The grades are something they should already know kind of the second they get put in. Maybe not that quickly, but with the power of technology now, I don't know how many of us are still using just the paper grade book where you wouldn't know unless you looked at your kid's homework, right? Parents are aware of what their kids' grades are. So their conference experience is never really revolved around that anymore. It's revolved around maybe behavior or maybe expectations, maybe what their kid wants to be doing next quarter. And the student-led conference really takes some of that onus off the teacher. And instead of the teacher being the driver of the bus, you have to step to the side a little bit. And that is definitely uncomfortable for some people, I would say. I think once you can let go of that control, it definitely is a more rewarding process overall from what I've seen, because I would argue that if you're just going over the report card, you don't need to be having conferences at all. That's the argument I would make. If you're still doing it the way where you're just going to sit down and go over the report card and let parents ask questions about it, you don't need to have a parent-teacher conference at all, because everyone has an email and a phone. They can call you if they have questions about their kids' grades. If their kid is really struggling, you should be calling them to talk about their kids' work. Conferences don't serve that function anymore. Conferences really serve the role of goal setting, relationship building, expectation management. They do that nowadays in 2023. The days of getting your report card, and you ever see that Simpsons episode where he changes like all the D's to A's? He just like puts a line through them because they're all kind of swoopy, right? Conferences are not like that anymore. Now, I'm sure everyone listening already knows that. I'm sure what the people listening are wondering is, okay, is there a smoother, faster, less stressful way to do conferences? And I think this model at the beginning is going to be more work and more stress, and it's going to be a little more difficult. But once you get that format up and running, once you have it, they have the slideshow, the kid knows how to do it, the kid knows where to put this information, the parents know what to expect. I think once you get to that point, it actually allows teachers to step back from conferences. And instead of, you put on your helmet and your flak jacket and you grab your shield because you got one of those conferences coming up, you go, hey, I got to step back. The parents know everything that's coming, and it's now just their kid that gets to explain it to them, and I'm just there. So I think it's definitely a little easier from that end. Mike, has that been your experience with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm seeing a lot of parallels in this conversation with ones that we've had before about something like proficiency-based learning. Because in proficiency-based learning, the student really becomes the director of their education to a point. I mean, of course, it's guided through standards and so forth, but in that model, the student really owns their learning. And I think the shift here between the traditional parent-teacher conference that you're talking about is similar to where the teacher is the sage on the stage. I know everything, and I'm going to dump info into the brains of these kids. And it's the same thing as the teacher directing the parents. I know everything to know about your kid, and so I'm going to dump info into your head, tell you how your kid's behaving in my class, tell you what I expect for them from their grades, and where I think they're going to go. There's that direct onus of I am telling you how this is, versus the collaborative approach. If a student is involved in their learning, we've talked about the ownership that they're going to have. I think it's also going to create a passion in them and maybe a drive in them. I also think it's going to uncover layers of learning for teachers about a kid. If you have a kid that says, I have no goals, I have no passion, I have no desire to learn any of this stuff, when am I ever going to use this in real life? You have the opportunity to speak into them. And we know that, that's being able to apply something really shows active learning. If you see a student understand, hey, I do need to know this, and this is now embedded in a goal, you've seen success in collaborating with the kid. So it changes it from direction and imperatives to collaboration and some passion. So I think anytime you can do that with a kid, you're modeling what we want them to do when they're in the workforce. I want a teacher on my staff like that is an initiative person, somebody that's going to get it done, somebody that's passionate about it. So we need to start creating that in our students. as soon as possible. I also think a student-led conference is not really a one and done. If you're talking about shifting to a model like this, I think you're looking at something that you need to think broader about. How does this impact the entire year for a student? A student-led conference is just one pinpoint, but how are you assessing their success with the goals? How are they reporting back to their parents? How are they showing that they've achieved some goals and then evaluating what their new steps might be? So it's not really just a one-off student-led conference. It's going to be what's the whole view of it on the entire year to take a student from point A to whatever point they're capable of achieving.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Is that it's making it a more present piece in their school experience and in their learning. And honestly, it's more like what the quote unquote real world is like. When has your boss slid across the table to you a report card and be like, well, these are your grades, we'll call your mom, and that's the end of our conference? It never happens. And even for teacher evaluations, there's a lot of, hey, explain this part to me. Hey, tell me what happened here. Hey, what are your goals for next year? Hey, tell me, this was awesome. Let's explain more about this. This wasn't so great. Can you tell me what happened? Those are still very much more teacher-led and more, employee-led in the workplace. You very rarely are going to get a card that has all your scores on it, right? There might be a formal evaluation piece that requires that, but most of the evaluation is probably going to be observation and conversation. And so this is really preparing them more for the job market, more for life after school, which is what we want to do. We're not training them to be better school students because we have an end mark. We know in 8th grade or 12th grade or when they graduate from college, we know they're done. And they go and they do other things where they don't have those same requirements anymore. Some of the things we teach and train in schools don't necessarily apply once you get into the real world. For example, you ever attend a staff meeting? You know, as a teacher, kids should be quietly listening when the teacher is talking. If you've ever been to a staff meeting as a principal, you know there are some side conversations. Every once in a while somebody checks a text message. That happens. And I'm not saying to the point where it's like destroying your meeting, but it's less, hey, you must do this exactly, and it's more freedom. It's more, you're responsible and I need to trust you with that responsibility to use it appropriately. And that's really what these conferences stress to kids. You have control over your learning. You have control over how successful or unsuccessful you will be this year. You have control over what goals you want to set for yourself. We'll put limits on that, absolutely, because you're a kid. We'll put some guide rails on it. But you, at the end of the day, are responsible for learning or not learning. I cannot make you learn. I cannot pour the science book into your ear and then, hey, great, you got it. You got to want to do it, and you got to put in the work to do it.
Yep. No, and you're absolutely right. And the other thing too, I've never heard of a child that said, a parent-teacher conference is really motivating me to do well. They're not gonna do that. I mean, of course you have the parents that walk out of there and say, hey, you had a terrible conference and so we need some work to do. You have the parents that walk out of there and say, hey, everything's great, let's go get an ice cream cone. But it's never really been, I don't think it's a motivating factor. Like Rob said earlier too, you don't need to, none of the grades should be a surprise. Nothing in that conference should be a surprise. So if you're still really passionate, or you really think, hey, parent-teacher conferences, though, if I'm going to talk about the kid, I should do it with the parent, maybe without the kid there, because I need to say some hard things. I need to whatever. I would suggest that doesn't need to be in the form of a parent-teacher conference formally the way that schools set them up. I'm not at all for a second saying we therefore throw the baby out with the bathwater and we don't meet with parents and we just decide, it has to be the kid every time. There are those circumstances where students are struggling. You need to have that tough conversation with the parents. But in a time when you have maybe taken days off of school, like we have, in order to talk about student progress, I would challenge you with the question, why wouldn't you have the students be a part of that experience? And I know it's a change. I know it's a shift. It's a different thought process. But maybe you start making that one of your professional goals. Read up on it. There's a lot of great professional material out there regarding student-led conferences. There are schools, I'm sure schools around you that do them or do them successfully. You can learn from others too. What were some of the bumps in the road? What are some of the materials that they use? I know if you go on TPT, you can get a whole bunch of stuff TPT, I love and I hate it because there's some really good stuff and there's some really bad stuff. Of course, you got to vet it all, but there are resources out there. So if you really are stuck in kind of a parent-teacher conference model, do the research. Either it'll help affirm where you're at, or it'll encourage you to grow and to involve the students in their own learning.
Yeah, and we're not saying that if you're doing them the traditional way, you're doing them wrong. I'm not saying that.
No.
I see better benefits for the student when they have a more active piece in their conferences. What I would encourage you to do is, if you're listening and you have conferences coming up, which I think a lot of our listeners will have conferences coming up. I even know of some people that scheduled them over like the 30th and the 31st, so they didn't have to be at school during Halloween, which genius. But if you have conferences and you don't love everything about them, it's probably too late to change them for now, but you could definitely change them if you do them in the spring. Tweak what is not working and what do you need to change so it's working better for everybody. Because as with everything in schools, you are not set in stone with anything. Everything is flexible and everything is fluid and everything can be changed to a point. And so if you have something that could be better, what steps can you actively take to make it better? Because if you approach conferences and you go, oh, I hate parent-teacher conferences, this part never goes well, and I don't like this, and then that's all the thinking you put into it, in a year, I guarantee you know what you're going to do? I hate parent-teacher conferences, this part never goes well. You can do the exact same thing in a year. And so what can you do? What can you take? What can you tweak now so you can have a better experience? And hopefully it's something out of this episode that you can take something and, okay, I can change this. You know what? That's great. Maybe I'll have the kids explain the grades this year, and start small. You don't have to, like Mike said, throw the whole baby out with bathwater. You can make incremental changes to making something a little better. That's all we ask our kids to do anyway, isn't it? They're learning incrementally. They're learning little bits by little bits by little bits. And then at the end, we take a big snapshot of it, and that becomes their report card. But it doesn't have to happen all at once.
I totally agree with you. And I was going to say something very similar along those lines, is baby step this too. If you're in a school where you're going, oh, I don't know how I would get Mrs. Jones in fourth grade to ever think about doing this. Well, don't start with Mrs. Jones in fourth grade. You know that you've got an early adopter on your staff. I guarantee you. And if you haven't identified an early adopter, take a look around and say, if there was something new, who would I go to first to see if they would work with me to implement this? And go to that person and just say, hey, listen, I have this idea. Would you walk this road with me? And let the staff know you're doing it. Just say, hey, you know what? I'm trying this with this teacher. We're going to try some student-led conferences this round. And this teacher's going to then report back to see how it goes, because we're just trying something new. So start it with that one person. Start small on your staff as well. But then realize, and even be vulnerable with your parents. Hey, we're not doing parent-teacher conferences. We're going to switch to student-leds because our students have a voice and we want them to use that voice. And we've got some really cool things we're going to try with you. You're our first class. You're our guinea pigs. So we'll look for your feedback to see how it goes and see where it goes. I think you'll be excited. The students that I've seen that have done parent or student-led conferences, I've seen students that love it and students that hate it. And the students that hate it are typically paranoid of formally presenting to their parents, or they saying, I don't know what I want my goal to be. I don't know if I'm ever going to achieve that goal. Whatever they come up with. And those are the kids that at the end, I've seen them come full around and say, hey, I get that. That was actually kind of fun. It was better than I'm sitting in the hall while my parents talk to the teacher and I don't know what's being said.
Yeah, there's definitely some paranoia. I think for kids with the traditional model, it's a little scary. You sit there and you sit in the hallway and maybe play on your mom's phone or on your Switch or read a book or whatever it is kids do during conferences nowadays. And you go, I wonder what they're saying about me. Mm-hmm. And if you're a middle schooler, you probably know you have access to your grades. I think just like your parents do. If you're a middle school or high school, you're pretty aware. But no, that's a great point, is that it doesn't have to be this big thing. And having teachers pilot things is such a great experience and such a great thing to do. You do not have to have every classroom do the exact same thing in the exact same way at the exact same time. They are not cookie cutters, they are teachers. And so if you give them the freedom, hey, do you want to change this? I think that's a great idea. Why don't you try it out and then report back how everything went? And you can do that with specific curriculums. You can do that with different teaching methods. You can do that with procedures. You can do that with a ton of stuff, because you're never going to know if it works until you see it working. Everything is theoretical. And when we think of things, we can think of all the great things and we can think of all the pitfalls. And sometimes that's as far as we go because we go, no, well, this won't work because of this. But we're never going to workshop those problems unless it's up and running and on the road. There's a reason you test drive a car when you go to buy one. Most people. I know some people that don't, but most people will test drive it at least because they want to see how it actually performs. And that's what you're doing here. How does this theoretical idea that you want to try actually work? Mike, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that principle can be used, yeah, like you said, just across the board. And taking risks can be a lot of fun. But they're called risks for a reason. They may not pan out, but that's okay. That's, how many bajillion times did Thomas Edison mess up before he created the light bulb, right? It's also modeling for our kids. We want them to take risks. We want them to try new things. So there's so many good reasons why doing something like this, like a student-led conference, it's outside the box, but there's a lot of good reasons to say, hey, why not? Give it a try. If parent-teacher conferences, if you're doing them because we've always done it that way, then I challenge you. It's time to start thinking about try it a different way. Because if it worked for the people and the students of 1984, fantastic. We're 2023. Give it a try. See what happens. Take that risk, because I would also say this type of risk where you're putting the student at the center of their learning is exactly what we stand for as Lutheran schools. Our students are at the center of what we do. So make them the center, even in conference time.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway, and I think that's probably a good place to end this one. I know when we started this one, we're like, hey, can we really talk for more than 5 minutes about student-led conferences? Isn't it just like let the kid lead at the end? And here we are, 20-something minutes in. Mike, do you want to close this with a prayer and maybe a prayer for conferences coming up?
Let's do it. Yeah, absolutely. This could be a long prayer. Let's go to God. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity that we have to serve these wonderful children that you've created and that you've redeemed. And I pray that as we begin typical conference season here in our schools, I pray that you'd be with the kids as they know that their learning will be discussed, or their learning will be shared, or that they will be sharing it in whatever form our schools are doing right now. God, I pray that you'd be in those conferences, that you would guide the words of the teachers, the students, and the parents, that if it's student-led or if it's parent-teacher conferences, that what's happening here can enforce and strengthen the partnership that we value as Lutheran schools with the parents and the families that we serve. I pray, God, that you would use the talk that we've had here to maybe inspire teachers to be thinking a little bit differently about conferences and to maybe examine some other opportunities that might be there. Lord, when we take risks, we do things so that more might come to know about you. So for those teachers that are taking those risks right now and starting student-led or starting something different, I pray that you would bless their efforts, that you would walk beside them and assure them that you are with them in all that they do. Bless all who lead and bless all who serve in Jesus' name. Amen.